Hello, everybody. Welcome to Saturday night. Pat has just completed his emergency switching to the other computer, which is funny because we thought we had the echoing problem that we experienced last week all fixed. And yes, indeed, it was fixed by not having any audio whatsoever. So how are you doing, Pat?
I'm okay. Can you hear me?
Are you? Yes. Are you in push to talk mode?
No. No, not push
okay.
to talk, but it's just a microphone. So hopefully this will work and will be better. It's haven't got the kinks worked out of the new one yet.
So,
and
but
apparently,
yeah. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, and based on yesterday's, apparently the old computer eventually, or every now and then, decides to have problems too. So it's been good.
Yeah. So loads of fun. You can't trust technology. I say that as somebody who spent a good 6 years doing technical support back in the 90s. So I went off to graduate school to get a degree in national security studies. I was in graduate school when the Berlin Wall went down. I was going to be a Russian nuclear guy. Okay. So that wasn't what really killed all the jobs, though. At the time, it was Desert Storm sucked all the money out of the system, so there weren't any new hires for 2 years. And by the time the dust cleared, I did not have a master's degree. I had 3/4 of a master's degree, which rounds down to 0. And I had a job doing computer geek stuff, and so I spent the 90s as a computer geek. But I learned not to trust technology. That was reaffirmed on New Year's Eve. I volunteered to run a friend's New Year's Eve celebration for an organization that she belongs in. And the stuff that worked perfectly the day before didn't work at all. Failed on multiple accounts, couldn't get it to work. I won't name the software, but it rhymes with room. So
yeah. Yep, I get it. One day it works, one day it doesn't, and you haven't changed anything.
No. And I mean, the controls wouldn't show up. Mm-hmm. It's like you're supposed to click on this thing and the thing isn't there. And it was, yeah. I much prefer StreamYard, which is the technology we use for this show. So, yeah, the miracle of modern technology is that it's a miracle when it works right. There's a lot of truth to that, unfortunately. So, but that's the way this all works. So, how'd your New Year's Eve go, Matt? Pat? Matt.
Fine. I got home. I got home in the afternoon. Spent the week flying. Got home Thursday night or Thursday afternoon, and I think we just had kind of a quiet night at home. So nothing, nothing extraordinary. We hung out around the house. So kind of like Groundhog Day for the last 9 months.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of that. So, So speaking of the last 9 months, some of you have probably heard our colleague and friend David Weber is currently in the hospital with COVID. He's doing better than he was when he went in yesterday. His oxygen levels are back up, but he's doing the Remdesivir. Is that how you pronounce it? He's doing that course, and that's a 5-day minimum, so they won't even think about letting him out for 5 days. Remdesivir. Yeah, I think you're right.
Yep.
So they're not even going to think about letting him out for 5 days, and then they'll do it sort of day by day at that point. His wife also has tested positive. But last I heard, she was still at home. I haven't seen anything indicating that she's in. And I've exchanged Facebook messages with him today, and he was posting on Facebook. So I sent him a quick note saying, "Hey, you need anything? Just give it, let us know." And he immediately came back with a thumbs up. So, he's having been in the hospital myself a couple of years ago and had some miserable days. He's probably. It's amazing that you can be both that miserable and that bored at the same time, but it is definitely possible. So
those two things frequently go together.
Yeah, I remember the day after my last surgery. The day of, I was actually doing reasonably well, despite the fact that I had had abdominal surgery. The next day, I was absolutely and totally miserable, just physically miserable. Physically, it was the worst day of my life, and I just kept saying to myself, "The worst day of your life only lasts 24 hours. The worst day of your life only lasts 24 hours." I can't remember where I picked up that saying, but it actually really helped. So
yeah, it'll end.
Yeah, it'll end.
Or
So,
pass.
so keeping our fingers crossed for David and everybody else. And I had another friend whose mother was 88, I think, and she died of COVID. So wear your mask, everybody. Wear your mask, and it's not getting better in the short term. It's going to get a lot worse because it's an exponential thing, and so many more people as it spreads, and so many more people have it now than had it before. So your chances of getting it go up. I've been telling people that I'm thinking about this as if I'm a role-playing gamer. You're every time you encounter other human beings or engage in any risky behavior, you're rolling a die and trying to avoid something bad happening. The best result on the die roll table is nothing bad happens, right? There's no winning the lottery. There's just nothing bad happens. And so the best way to avoid rolling a bad number is to not roll the die. So, stay at home, stay hunkered down. And if you have to go out, wear a mask and do all the other things necessary to give you all the appropriate modifiers so that when you roll the die, the risk of rolling a 1 is less. But, if you roll the dice enough times, eventually, it doesn't matter how, roll the D1000 enough times, eventually you'll roll the 1. So keep that in mind, everybody. So, oh, well. So what else is going on, Pat? Do you do any flying? I guess.
Yeah. I was flying all last week. So
go any place interesting?
I went to Kalamazoo, Michigan. I went to Minot, North Dakota. I paused briefly in Dayton, Ohio, but
I felt the disturbance in the force.
Yeah. The plane did not break down there, so we were not able to go get lunch. And where else did we go? I think it was a lot of Kalamazoo and going to Minot, and flew through Minneapolis, and that was it. So de-iced some days. Some days were nice and clear and smooth. Other days were, marginal weather down to minimums, or not minimums, but pretty far down there. So got ice on the airplane, took ice off the airplane. It's all in a day's work.
Good to not have ice on the airplane.
It's very good not to have ice on the airplane.
So yes. I ordered a pizza today for the first time since this all started. I haven't had pizza is my favorite food, and I haven't had any pizza since February.
Well, that sounds like a personal. Why'd you wait so long?
Well, in part because I was trying to avoid risky behavior, and I read some stuff recently that said that actually the risk of food deliveries is pretty low. That the stuff just doesn't really. There are like next to no reported instances of somebody actually getting it because they had contaminated food. So right. I decided to just go ahead and do it. I'd been being super cautious, and I decided, you know what, it's the new year. I'm going to go ahead and order a pizza, despite the fact that it's not the best thing in the world for you. And I've been trying to be good about that stuff. But
way to throw caution to the wind.
Yes. So having given that sermon, I roll all the dice. So Pat and I were talking a little bit about what we should go on and do this today. And so I was going to do more naming and typings type stuff. And my original plan was to look at a couple of different science fiction universes with the idea that like next week we would do Star Trek, right? And sort of because Star Trek, of course, is not a science fiction universe. It's like 12 science fiction universes sort of flying in loose formation. So they're kind of all going along in the same direction. More or less. So that's going to take I'm not going to do a comprehensive survey. I don't think either Pat or I is intending to do a comprehensive survey, but we'll go and look at a few things about how they do stuff. I mean, if nothing else, there's this very interesting split between what you see in the original series, where they use terms like destroyer and heavy cruiser and very naval oriented terms. And then if you look at the next gen tech manual, you start seeing things like explorer as a class, and it's like, what the hell does that mean? So,
and in Deep Space Nine, they did talk about destroyer groups.
Yeah, and so they mix it up a little bit more, and it gets a little bit more there, and none of this stuff is really documented in terms of, like, there's no guide, right? There's no, like, here's the manual that they use, that either the polities in the universe. I'm gonna speak in terms of polities, right? Because I don't want to say countries, because the Federation isn't a country, but I want to, when I say polity, I'm talking about anything from a city-state up to, the Galactic Empire, right? We don't have the manuals that the polities use, and as I talked about last week, they do stuff, you oftentimes have one group to sort of deciding what your stuff is, and another group deciding what the other side is doing, right? So the U.S. Navy, submarine force sort of does naming and typing for themselves, but then O&I does it for other people's submarines using an entirely different set of criteria, or only vaguely related set of criteria. So with that being the case, unless you've got something else to do right now, I'll go ahead and pull my slides up.
Sounds good.
All right, so let me do that. Let me actually first, I need to do some moving around of the stuff. The hardest part of showing slides in this is the fact that I have to move all my windows around so that I can actually see stuff. So let me do this. Okay, sure. All right, can you see my screen, Pat?
Not yet.
Okay, I think Alec needs to click on the screen, because I don't have the magic power to. Alex said something in the chat about how he's fostering 3 dogs, which is part of the reason why he's producing that, and the fact that Lissa is out, and you can produce a show and sort of do all the other stuff at the same, and be a talking person at the same time, but it can be hard. So, all right, while we're waiting for Alec to come back and turn that on, I'll go ahead and start a little bit, because there's some stuff I can do that's basically, it's words on the slide, so you'll just get the words from me. I'm thinking that the naming and typing discussion, there's going to be at least another part, maybe a 4th one, so I'm calling it parts 1 through 3-ish, but I'm going to do part 2 today. A couple announcements so I don't forget, and I'll put these in the chat. First of all, I am currently involved with something called NavyCon. Some of you may have seen that before. We've done a couple of NavyCon presentations before. The first one was a live action event that was at the Naval Academy Museum back in 2017, and then we did one, I think it was 2017, it might have been 2018. Then we did one last June, I think, and then we did one in November, beginning of November. And so we've decided that we're going to start a podcast. So there's a bunch of us, there's about 8 of us that are going to do a NavyCon podcast, and it's going to be sort of a round robin with people picking the topics. Now, NavyCon is really more about using science fiction to illustrate real world things, right? I kind of do the opposite of that. So like I use real world ship design to illustrate science fiction topics and to sort of examine science fiction topics. And the NavyCon is more about like using science fiction ship design to look at real world topics. So it's a little bit different than say like what Pat and I do on the show. But it should be good, and I'll give you more information about the NavyCon podcast when we actually get it up and running. I don't have the information, but we've recorded the first two. I don't think either of them have gone up yet, but I'll give you more information next week. The second thing is I'm doing a talk at the Armchair Dragoons Digital Convention. The Armchair Dragoons are a bunch of wargame-oriented folks that I know, one or two guys in it. And they asked me if I'd come and give a presentation. So I'm doing a 90-minute presentation that I'm calling Naval Metaphors in Science Fiction, which is the version 2.0 of a talk that I've done for years now that I realized I never quite gelled. I was never really happy with it. But I didn't know why. And I've kind of figured out why I wasn't happy with it and what I need to do to fix it. And so it's going to, those of you who've been faithful viewers will certainly recognize some of the things that I've said in it, but it's going to be sort of a talk about like how real world naval combat works and then also how that translates into science fiction. So that's on Saturday, the 16th of January, 2021 at 3 p.m. Eastern time. And I will put a link. In fact, I'll do it right now so I don't forget. I'm going to put it into the chat, and then I'll also put it into the comment field after the show is over. So that's it for the announcements. And hold on a second, I lost StreamYard there. There, it's back. So Alec, are you there? If you're there, please share my slides. Okay, so on to naming and typing. Like I said, mostly it's going to be focusing on Renegade Legion, but not entirely. So as a refresher from last week, there's two different processes that I'm talking about when I say naming and typing. There's the process whereby what the polity describes its own systems as. So in other words, like what the U.S. Navy calls U.S. Navy stuff. So, like we call the Los Angeles class an attack submarine. We call the Virginia class an attack submarine, an SSN. We made that decision. The United States Navy made that decision. Nobody else did. But then there's also what a polity calls other people's system. So like the Office of Naval Intelligence, which is part of the U.S. Navy and has the responsibility for doing naming and typing for other people's systems, would look at the Virginia class and would call it an SSGN, a cruise missile submarine, because it's got separate tubes that it uses to fire cruise missiles out of. And so that being the case, you've got this situation where there could be a mismatch in this stuff, and what other people call stuff isn't necessarily what we call it. So why don't they match? Well, first of all, it's two different processes done by different people, and those two different processes are really done for different reasons, right? We've got our own consistent nomenclature with ourselves, and we understand what it is, but when we're doing other people's stuff, we're trying to sort of fit it in to an overarching scheme so that we can understand what's going on there. And so when it comes to other people's systems, we're a little bit more methodical, and we don't let sort of other considerations get in the way. And I've told you previously about how we solved the cruiser gap. Congress thought we didn't have enough cruisers, and we solved that problem by saying, okay, that thing that we were going to call a destroyer, we're going to call it a cruiser. Problem solved. We're building a whole bunch of new cruisers. So the other thing is, one of the reasons why they don't match is that when we make the call for somebody else, we're missing a lot of data. We'll generally make that call pretty early, and we don't know necessarily what they're building, what they're going to use it for, how it's going to be equipped, none of that stuff. We generally know about that stuff for ourselves, right? Because we know what we're building. Other people generally know about it for us because we publish all that stuff in advance, generally, more or less. And so, but we don't know that for other people. So when they're building something, we may just know, yeah, they're building a submarine and it's about 400 feet long. So it probably is a ballistic missile submarine, because why would you have a 400-foot long submarine that's like 40 feet in diameter if it's not a ballistic missile submarine? Why would you do that? Okay. And so we start making decisions when we don't have a whole lot of data. Generally, these types are designated by size and purpose, right? So if it's bigger, you might call it a cruiser. If it's smaller, you might call it a destroyer. Sometimes over the years, for a long time, when we said cruisers were anti-aircraft platforms, destroyers were anti-submarine platforms. And so, that's one way of doing it. You might just do it by size. But all of these things change over time, right? The system changes over time. You might redefine how something is set up. You might redefine how you think about something over time. You might re-equip something and make physical changes to it. So even if the system doesn't change, you change your designation. I should emphasize that other countries' internal designations don't match for the same reasons. There was a time period where we were declaring that destroyers were really cruisers. About that same time period, if the Brits, if I remember correctly, were declaring things that we would call a destroyer, they were calling them frigates, because frigates were smaller, and as a result, it indicated to their population that they were being frugal. Or some such thing. So people play political games with that stuff. And lastly, when we build a ship, we assign it a name, we assign it a class and a type. So like, for instance, USS Enterprise, a Constitution class heavy cruiser would be an example of how all that stuff fits together. So, and when we're looking at a foreign ship, we might not know any of that stuff. So, okay. So, Alec, if you're there, if you could share my slides, that'd be great. All right. That's a shame. I actually went to the trouble of getting pictures this week. You all are missing out on pictures. Hopefully later on I'll go back and show you some of the pictures. So I'm now going to largely switch directly to how a polity names and types its own stuff. So previously, there's the US Navy talking about US Navy stuff and the Office of Naval Intelligence talking about other people's stuff. Now I'm really going to be talking about like the equivalent of what the US Navy says about its stuff. We do have a few in Star Trek. We actually do have a few examples. Like Pat pointed out to me. In fact, Pat, I'll let you do it. What do the Klingons call the Federation stuff?
Well, in Star Trek 3, we hear them refer to, so Star Trek 3, the Klingons have just destroyed USS Grissom, and Enterprise is approaching the Genesis planet. For just to recap where we are here. And the Klingon ship is cloaked, and it's watching the Enterprise approach the planet, and they refer to the Federation, the USS Enterprise, as a Federation battlecruiser. So, obviously they seem to put everything in, more of a militaristic term, just as they saw the Genesis device as a way to scour a planet, as opposed to, a way to turn a lifeless rock into a nice garden. So, so that is, I think that is one of the only times we hear the Klingons classify a particular ship of the Federation, but it goes to their thinking, I believe.
Yeah, I think it does too, and that's sort of consistent that the Federation calls it a heavy cruiser because a battle cruiser kind of implies, well, I guess heavy cruiser implies a warship too, unless you kind of define, It's not too big a lift to think of something that's called a cruise ship. You might call a cruiser.
Sure. Now, in Gene Roddenberry's novel for the motion picture, and stop me if I said this before, but in that novel, they talk about the USS Enterprise as being the most powerful ship in Starfleet, and that really more appropriately it should be called a battleship, but they don't want to call things battleships in the Federation, so they go with the heavy cruiser designation instead. So that was the other sort of naming and typing piece that we got. And assuming Gene Roddenberry actually wrote the book that his name is on, it even comes from him. So.
Yeah, and I used to know the answer as to whether he wrote that or not, and I can't remember what the answer is.
Yeah.
But we're switching over to talking about science fiction, so we can make stuff up in science fiction. The authors get to make stuff up. It looks like Alec is just posting. Alec, can you share my slides, please? Yay! Okay, so this is, I said that I have added pictures. You haven't actually missed any pictures yet. This is the first picture. So what we're looking at is a picture of the USS Wisconsin against the hulk of the USS Utah. Now, Utah was attacked at Pearl Harbor, but had already been used as an anti-aircraft training ship or something. It was a training ship, and it was basically been stripped of most of its stuff already, because it was basically functioning as a target. And so, it's an older ship. It's a 1916 ship, but both of those ships are battleships, right? Nobody would think that those are the same class. Nobody would think that those are you might be forgiven to think that they're different types. You certainly wouldn't think that they're the same capabilities, but they're taken 16 to 44 is 28 years apart. It's a lot of change in 28 years. Mm-hmm. So things change over time, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Renegade Legion. So this is a FASA game series from the 1980s. It was their attempt to get the Star Wars license. When they didn't get the Star Wars license, they decided to roll their own background to go along with it. I didn't include, there's some other supplements here, and there's also a role-playing game that came out with it that was actually kind of cool. These are the main board games. There's also a grav chariot racing game that I don't have included here, but these are the main board games. Centurion was armored combat, as you can see. Interceptor was fighters. Leviathan is capital ships, and Prefect was basically planetary invasions, where you'd go through and you'd do and do like the initial stuff, and then you'd land troops on the planet, and sort of bridged Leviathan and Centurion. And I want to come back to Prefect in a future show, because there's an operational briefing in the game Prefect where they basically describe tactical space combat in that universe. Well, actually sort of operational space combat in that universe, and how to think about when you're conducting combat, how to think about combat in a vector movement type environment. So I'd like to come back to that at some future episode. I'll do that. I'm going to do a little bit more about Prefect later on in this one, like in the next couple of slides. So a couple of key differentiations between Renegade Legion and the real world. So the primary ship killer is a spinal mount mass driver. It fires, they call the projectile a crowbar, and they can be fairly good size, and they're moving at several kilometers a second, and it'll leave a mark if it hits. And bigger ships have bigger mass drivers, and they fire bigger crowbars. All large warships in this universe generally carry smaller craft, some of which are called fighters. And hence, all of them can be considered a hybrid carrier, in the sense that that I think I've talked about in the show before. So as a general rule, with aircraft carriers at least, there's a couple of things to keep in mind about them. One is that the reason why you have an aircraft carrier is because of the difference in the media between the sea and the sky. And the flight deck of an aircraft carrier largely functions as a door between the sea and the sky. It's how you get something that was on the sky onto the sea, and how you get something that was on the sea into the sky. And you need that large flight deck, and you design a ship around that large flight deck to make the flight deck large, to give it a big hangar, to make the flight deck move through the water fast, to make it stable. And all those things sort of point towards a large ship. And so you have this thing that very distinctly looks like what we would recognize as an aircraft carrier. And while you're having that aircraft carrier thing, that its job description really sort of pushes it towards a particular mode of operation. It does not make sense to have your aircraft carrier like in the line of battle. You want it sort of removed because it's got to follow the wind. It's got to point into the wind to do flight ops, and you don't want to have to deal with incoming shells, etc., when you got all this stuff on the deck and it's not very well armored compared to something like a battleship. So it's not something that you want going toe to toe with anything else. You kind of want it at some remove. Battleship, on the other hand, has to be part of the line of battle to concentrate fire, and it's a different thing. So terrestrially, it doesn't make sense to have a thing that's half battleship and half aircraft carrier. It just doesn't, right? They've two distinct modes of operation. They're trying to do totally different things. Those functions get in the way. If you're a pure aircraft carrier, you can optimize for being an aircraft carrier. If you're a pure battleship, you can optimize for being a battleship. If you're trying to do both, by definition, you are sub-optimizing across two different axes. So hybrid carriers are carrier battleships are A, really, really cool, B, really, really dumb, at least on planet Earth. Out in space, when you don't need a flight deck and you can just sort of push things out the side and they float away because fighters fly in space and the ships are in space and there's not this doorway between one media and another thing, makes a lot more sense in space than it does on the ground. And so, put a couple of fighters on it, right? You see this in Babylon 5 with the Omega class. They carry a fair number of fighters. And in Renegade Legion, that's what you see. They carry small craft, and everything is an aircraft carrier to some degree, or a spacecraft carrier. I'd also like to point out that FASA did something that, boy, not very many people can pull off in the wargaming or science fiction realm, and that is to create a universe where both fighters and carriers and battleships make sense all at the same time, right? Usually you end up with this thing where it's like, there's one weapon system that really kind of dominates, and everything else is there to optimize that one weapon system. So you've got escorts to make your aircraft carriers better. Before that, you had escorts to make your battle line better. And, originally aircraft carriers were going to be an escort to help make the battle line better. And every now and then it's like, okay, we came up with this new idea and it turns out the new idea is better. And now it's the thing that we're sort of optimizing against. There's lots and lots of science fiction universes that tried to have battleships and spacecraft carriers do their thing and sort of declare that they're equals. And no, it really just doesn't work. FASA made it work. And the way they did it is they basically said there are certain situations where fighters are really, really, really important. And they also managed to artificially constrain the number of fighters involved to make it a more playable game. Good for them. Good game design. And there's other realms where battleships make the difference, right? And so that roughly translates into the game Interceptor versus the game Leviathan. So, and the way they did that is, and this is all explained in Prefect, when a ship moves through hyperspace, it casts a shadow, and that the size of that shadow is based upon the mass and speed of the ship. Bigger ships moving faster cast larger shadows. Large formations can function like bigger ships, and they cast a larger shadow. So you can hear it coming from a lot farther away. It makes it louder. You can hear it coming. And there's detection stations all along the frontier, spaced in such a way that they will be able to hear a big mass of ships coming through fast. And those ships have to be moving fast. They can't go slow and sneak through the system, because life support in this universe for a capital ship is only good for about 30 days-ish, right? And so I think it was 30 days. And so the end result is you really kind of have to be moving fast, because otherwise you'll just run out of life support. And so that all those things force you into a particular mode of operation. That means that when you're moving towards a target and you've got a group of battleships, they can be detected in advance. So because they're detected in advance, and because you've got faster than light communications, what ends up happening is the warning goes back to the theater commander. The theater commander turns to the reserve force. They're able to sort of predict where they're going to go, at least on the axis of attack, if not exactly where they're going to go. And so they move assets to do an intercept. And at some point, it will become apparent exactly where they're going to go, because when you're in hyperspace, or their equivalent of hyperspace, T-space, I think they call it, you're basically limited to moving in straight lines. And so if you want to change course, you have to come out of T-space and accelerate in a different direction and move and see what I said earlier about life support being a real limiting factor. You don't have time for stuff like that. And so because of the way that all that works, all the big ships are in a theater reserve force behind the lines, and the theater commander has the theater reserve that he can send off to do stuff. I should mention, this game is a game on a scale. Remember how I said it was the Star Wars? They were aiming for the Star Wars license. So this is a galactic empire. And so it's the entire galaxy is part of this fight. And you've got the Galactic Empire against basically part of a spiral arm of the galaxy. And those guys are actually drawing in supplies for Andromeda, because the Andromedans are worried that the Terran overlord government, the Galactic Empire, once they've conquered the galaxy, they'll start looking at other galaxies. So, let's see what. So the end result of this is that if you want to raid a system, you do it with a relatively small carrier that dumps out high-performance fighters when it gets there. So you might have like a Corvette-sized carrier, which will have like five fighters on it, 10 fighters on it. It comes to the edge of the system, dumps them out, goes on a hyperbolic orbit around to the other side to pick them up again, and these guys do a high-speed pass through the system. And because it's so small and its shadow is so small, by the time they hear it coming, the theater commander doesn't have the opportunity to send assets. And so the theater commanders don't even bother pulling together small assets. They only deal with big assets like battleships and cruisers and destroyers and those formations. Small assets are all dispersed locally, and they form the local defense forces, and so they will do intercepts. And so the end result of this is an interceptor. A large raiding force might be 4 fighters that are going to do a high-speed pass on a facility, and the defenders come out to try to prevent that from happening. And you might end up with all the combat being a high-speed pass. It's not a dogfighting kind of game. It's really kind of a high-speed pass kind of game. And the local resources end up having to deal with all this. And like I said about coming back to it and wanting to talk about it in Prefect, that's really what that essay I talked about in Prefect is about. It's about how do you think about that problem. So, Pat, any thoughts on this? Have you ever played Renegade Legion? Have you ever seen it?
Yes, I actually used to play the Interceptor game pretty religiously. Got to design your own fighters, have dogfights, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, it was good. I really enjoyed it. Played that in high school quite a bit. And I actually have a copy of Leviathan. I have not actually played it though. I was in some game store and they had a little stack of things, and Leviathan happened to be one of like 3 games that I could buy for $20, so I picked that up too. So,
Okay.
but I'm not. So, anyways, so I've got that one.
I've never played Leviathan. I have played Interceptor. Interceptor had this really interesting wiring diagram thing that would on how damage promulgated. So like, and also an interesting armor system where you had little templates that you would then over.
I've kept it all these years because I kind of liked it. It was
Yeah.
sort of unique. You had a 10 by 10 block for armor, depending on how heavily armored your fighter was on the left side, the front, and the back, and everything. And then depending on the weapon you used, there was a template. So you weren't just marking off, I've got 50 points of armor. Okay, I take 50 points of damage and I mark it all off. The depth of the weapon that hits you determines if some of that happens to still penetrate your armor. So it was a pretty neat. I thought it was a pretty neat system. And then you went through a wiring diagram with your damage and everything. So.
And then later on they changed when they got to the ground game, and with Leviathan they realized that the wiring diagram for the fighter was pretty complicated. The wiring diagram for the dreadnought was going to be oh my god level. And so they replaced that with sort of a blocks of systems underneath the armor. So once you got through the armor, you then started doing the template thing on the blocks of stuff that's underneath. And I know that at one point somebody had picked up the license and was going to do a second edition of Interceptor. The guy who was going to be the line manager for that was a friend of mine, since passed away. And so they somewhere I've got the beta rules for it where they basically had redone the Interceptor second edition was going to have that block system, and I've got a beta of that someplace in my files. As one of the 149 boxes of books and related stuff in the storage unit that maybe someday I'll be able to take out. But the system worked really pretty slick, and the artwork was gorgeous, and they had done some thinking through how to make all this stuff work. And it had some of the usual FASA-isms. FASA always used semi-arbitrary rules about power management, about power supplies, to limit you when you're doing the design a thing portion of the game. So there was a limitation on the number of engines you could have, and there was a limitation for on the number of turrets you could have on the when you were designing a tank, and there was a limitation on I can't remember if they have reactors or not, separate from the engines, but there's a limitation on all this stuff, and you sort of look at it and go, why? And the real answer, it's like with battle mechs, the real answer is we do that because it keeps the system simpler. I always thought with battle mechs, the right answer was to use realistic scaling on structure, that as your mech gets bigger, a larger and larger proportion of the mass has to be internal structure until you get to the point where like the 1,000-ton mech is nothing but a big block of metal, because that's all the rules let you do. But they would do things with the reactors, so instead you get to the point where your mech is really a fort because it can't actually move. Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about Leviathan and the capital ship construction rules. I'm going to talk about this, the naming and typing stuff, about how in universe they describe stuff, but what I'm really doing, I'm pulling it out of the ship construction rules, because they don't really say, here's how naming and typing works in this universe. What they do is they say, here's what, if you do X, you're building this type of ship, and if you do Y, you're building this other type of ship. And that just because you can build a ship with a certain configuration doesn't mean it's a good idea in universe. And in places where I don't think it's a good idea, I'm kind of making some blanket statements that sort of ignore some of the options that would technically be allowed. So, you can say a car has 4 wheels, right? Okay, well, what if it has 3 wheels? Is it a car? Well, okay, you might be able to make an argument that it is. What if it has 6 wheels? Does a car have to have 4 wheels? Well, okay, maybe you could make an argument that a car could have 6 wheels. But the DMV is probably going to say a car has 4 wheels. And so I'm going to make a blanket statement that says a car has 4 wheels. And if it doesn't have 4 wheels, it's not a car. Because some of the options might not make sense, right? 3-wheel cars in particular aren't particularly safe. They have a tendency to tip over. And in most places, when you see one of those funky 2-seater roadster 3-wheel things, it's actually classified as a motorcycle.
Mm-hmm.
So warships in this universe are really sort of classified along 2 axes, defined along 2 axes. Size, which it really is done according to power rating, but power rating is sort of directly related to size. So there's later on where they sort of say, okay, if it's this power rating, if you're this mass, you use this power rating. The power rating is what determines what class you fall into, but there's a band of power ratings for a given size. And so you end up with corvettes, escorts, okay, destroyers, frigates, cruisers, and battleships. I'll note in this universe, frigates are bigger than destroyers, kind of like the old U.S. system. And those are the class of ships that you can have. But then there's this other thing that goes along with it, which is the presence or absence of this spinal mount mass driver, that mass driver that throws crowbars. And so I quoted a couple of rules here. Carriers can fall into any class and their placement depends entirely on their chosen size. Okay, so you can have a destroyer class carrier, a cruiser class carrier, a battleship class carrier, corvette class carrier. You can have very small carriers, you can have very large carriers. So class is about size. In this case, it's really type. It says class, but I would say type in that regard, because class is usually, like in the U.S. Navy usage, when we say class, we don't say a destroyer class, we say a destroyer type. A class would be like USS Enterprise class, or a Constitution class, or an Enterprise class. The type would be heavy cruiser. Carriers may not carry spinal mounts. So if you put a spinal mount on it, it's not a carrier. Carriers, on the other hand, of destroyer size or greater, 1/3 of the ship's power must be devoted to the fighter operations hull. It doesn't say what happens if you don't put a spinal mount on it and you don't meet the requirement to be a carrier. It might be buried in there somewhere and I didn't find it. So that might be one of those 3-wheeled car things where like nobody would ever do that because it doesn't make sense to have something like that. But, during World War II, we built destroyers that had nothing but small guns, relatively small guns, because we wanted to use them for anti-aircraft purposes, basically. We built 6-inch guns when all the other, did I say destroyers or did I say cruisers?
Destroyers, I think.
I meant to say cruisers. Sorry about that. We built 6-inch gun cruisers largely because we wanted the rapid firing guns for anti-aircraft purposes and stuff like that, when everybody else was building 8-inch gun cruisers, and that's what the treaty limitation had said. And we just kind of basically kept cranking out 8-inch gun cruisers, with the exception of the large cruisers, sometimes referred to as battle cruisers, of the Alaska class. And so there had been this pre-war artificial limitation. You really can't understand naval ship types in World War II without especially in the Pacific, without understanding the Washington and London naval treaties and the distorting effect that the Washington naval treaty had on everybody's design processes. But, so we built this thing that really was kind of a weird thing, which is kind of the equivalent here of not having fighter ops and not having spinal mounts. But in general, this is how this works. But this type of stuff is really the only place that they talk about function in this, right? So an aircraft, spacecraft carrier, a carrier is something that has this function of carrying spacecraft, but a destroyer doesn't really seem to differentiate. The destroyer is a destroyer because it's a particular size, not because we're designing it to do a particular weird thing. We're designing it for this particular mission. It's not really a mission thing in the same way that destroyers started in the real world. So, Pat, any thoughts on this?
No, not really. I'm just nothing deep at this point.
Okay. So let's do a quick thought about size and time. Ships of a given type have a tendency to get larger over time. These are all battleships that we're looking at here. And on the far left-hand side, we have the Mikasa, followed by the Michigan. So the Michigan is the first dreadnought type ship that we built, that we, the United States, built. And it was laid down before the Dreadnought, the HMS Dreadnought, but we built it slower, and so the Dreadnought finished first, which is why we talk about Dreadnought battleships and not Michigan battleships. Personally, I think Dreadnought battleships sounds better than Michigan battleships, so I'm okay with that. But, we've got Mikasa that fought the flagship at the Battle of Tsushima, so that's a pre-Dreadnought. The Michigan is the first Dreadnought type ship laid down, so it's like came out in like 1906-ish. And then on the other end, we have the Wisconsin that was probably in commission in 44, if I remember correctly, maybe 43. And so, like that other picture of the Wisconsin next to the Utah, those are all battleships. You wouldn't think that they're the same. Are you going to call them all? How do you differentiate these? Are you going to call them all battleships during their entire life? Or are you going to change the type? Maybe maybe at some point you stop calling it a battleship, right? The standard moved, right? You didn't change, the world changed. So, or you can add another designator. You could say, it went from being a first-rate battleship to being a second-rate battleship, or a reserve battleship, or something like that.
And maybe it depends on how long you're going to keep the thing in service based on technological changes.
Yes, because, like, for instance, by the time Wisconsin is in service, Michigan is not. There were some of that, but because of the London Naval Treaty, etc., you end up with some weird stuff. Hood is a lot closer to that era. Like Hood is I'm trying to remember when Texas came out. Hood is somewhere between Texas and Michigan when it came out, because it came out in like 1918, 1919, 1920, that time frame. And it's still considered a frontline ship in 1940-ish when it fought, I think it was 40 when it fought Bismarck.
Yeah, 1940.
I couldn't remember if it was 40 or 41. Still considered a frontline ship, right? And that's because we just stopped building for about 15 to 20 years. There was this naval holiday, and we all agreed that we weren't going to build stuff for a while. And so sometimes that stuff stays in service longer than you might think, and it gets revamped, and et cetera, et cetera. But what if you do have these in? What do you do? This gets worse when you move off planet, and by that I mean there's no incidence of a United States Navy carrier battle group discovering a country they'd never seen before. Right? It just doesn't happen. We know what everybody else is out there, what the possible adversaries are. By and large, we understand what their capabilities are, et cetera, et cetera. There's no equivalent on Earth of what happens on a weekly basis on any Star Trek show, of the Enterprise goes someplace and encounters a new race that we don't know anything about. We have to sort of figure out what their tech level is, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you sort of now when you're trying to name and type other people's stuff, we may go, the Federation may look at stuff and go, oh my God, that's a battleship. And when you talk to them, they go, no, actually, we kind of think of that as a lifeboat. Or, that's a Corvette. We build big in our empire, right? So, hey, Pat.
Yeah.
If you were doing something like, I don't know, designing a game, how might you approach this?
Okay, so all right. So the Klingons, we know from Star Trek that they tend to use the same hull for a long time, right? Or at least we can infer that. We see little Klingon birds of prey, like we saw it in Star Trek 3 the first time. So that's the 2280s. And, we still see different versions of that ship of varying sizes throughout the next generation. We see that they have the Katinga class battle cruiser, and those ships were used in we saw them in the motion picture the first time in the 2260s, and they're still in use by the Klingons in the next generation. So the Klingons keep those hulls around for a long time, but they but presumably they keep upgrading them and putting new black boxes in there and upgrading the warp cores and the weapons and all that kind of stuff. So the ship becomes useful over its entire lifespan. And so if we look at let's just say the Katinga class cruiser, which we think of as a battle cruiser, or at least, kind of refer to it as a battle cruiser. I've always thought of it, and this is just my own headcanon, but that a Katinga class cruiser from the same time period is probably 80 to 85% as combat capable as the Enterprise class from the motion picture. So it could still be a heavy cruiser, or we could still classify it as a heavy cruiser. Now, let's just say 20 years, 30 years later, the Klingons are still using that hull design, but by now they've made some bigger, more advanced ships. Is it still a heavy cruiser? Maybe now it's considered a light cruiser. And then as we keep going, and now we've got the Negvar and the Vorcha and the Kavort class cruisers, which are all much larger, much more advanced, more powerful. Now the Katinga class cruiser, maybe it's just a frigate or a destroyer or something like that. So, and that's how I've approached the Klingons in the in the game that I'm working on, where I take the D5, which we see in Enterprise, and then we have it in the Axanar time frame. And is it still a battle cruiser? Because they've got the D6 now, right? So the D6 is their frontline battle cruiser, and so maybe at the time of Axanar, the D5 is now a light cruiser, and then maybe in Kirk's time period, they've got the D5 cruiser still, but maybe then it's just a destroyer. And then if there's a version of it that's still in use, let's say around the motion picture time frame, and we have no evidence of this or anything, I'm just, maybe at that point they call it a frigate, even though it's more powerful than it was 100 years ago, before it's had all these upgrades. So I hope that's kind of clear, but that's one way I've thought of the Klingons as, you would, what you call the ship probably gets downgraded relative to all the newer ships that are out there. So that's one way to do it. And that's the route I took with the Klingon, setting up the Klingons.
Yeah, and that gets really interesting when you start talking in terms of when you start thinking about the functionality. What's the mission that ship is designed to do, right? So if you're if your definition of what a cruiser does involves high speed, and you've got a battleship that's been sort of left in the technological dust, and as a result, it's not a frontline battleship anymore, simply calling it a cruiser, it may fail the speed test in that case. And so it's not, if you're basing those designations on something more than just size, you run into some problems with it moving down the list. Now, hopefully, one way that this sort of gets dealt with in the real world, and you see this with airplanes all the time, right? Is that okay? It used to be a frontline fighter, but it's no longer a frontline fighter, so you give it to the Air National Guard, right? So they get something that's no longer the new shiny thing. The new shiny stuff is reserved for the Air Force. It goes to the National Guard because it's still useful to have that thing, to have that stuff, because if it's a big war and you have to bring the second line stuff in, you bring the second line stuff in. But nobody pretends that it's the first line stuff. David Weber does sort of a version of that in the Honor Harrington series, in that what you end up happening there is over time ships get bigger, and that has to do with the inertial compensators. So they're trying to maintain a minimum performance, and so they don't want to go below a certain threshold. And the power of the inertial compensators to work on a given size ship, it sort of defines what the high end is at any given tech level. Well, then there's an improvement in the inertial compensators, and that allows them to build a bigger ship, right? So they're solving for the ship size; they're not solving for speed. So they solve for ship size, and they get a bigger ship as a result of that. So now you've got these older ships that are less combat capable. So what do you do with them? Well, I remember having a conversation with David about this, because he had battleships and dreadnoughts and super dreadnoughts. Now, Manticore never really built battleships. They weren't a battleship building power when battleships were the new hotness, and so they went basically from cruisers to to dreadnoughts. So they don't have the problem of having battleships around, but the People's Republic of Haven has a ton of battleships around. Well, why don't they get rid of them, right? They could recycle them. They have large crews. So why still have them? And the answer is because they've got an internal security problem. They occasionally have planets in revolt, and they have to go and convince them that the planet shouldn't be in revolt. And while a super dreadnought, a battleship might not be useful to go and be in the line of battle against Manticore, it's perfectly capable for doing the equivalent of showing a recalcitrant planet the error of its ways. And so that's an example of sort of taking something off frontline duty. And in the case of Haven, they happen to have an appropriate second or third line duty that they use with it. Whereas Manticore in that same situation would say, we're severely manpower limited. This thing doesn't have any combat capability. It's actually a net loss. We're better off getting rid of it. So let's just get rid of it and recycle what we can recycle. And maybe the stuff we can't recycle, we use as training ships, or we use them as targets or whatever. And so that's kind of how that works there. I think this is my last slide. Yeah, that's from we've already done this a while ago, so that's my last slide. So it is not taking, let's see if I can turn that off. Oh, stop screen share, there we go. Okay. I think actually we're kind of done, right? We're at the end of the hour.
We are at the end of the hour, yep.
So, hey, Alec, are you there?
I am here.
So what's the status on your internet, just out of curiosity?
It sucks. It's cell phone based, so every once in a while I'll just crap out. So that's what happened. So I guess, but you guys kept going, I guess, yes?
Yeah, we kept going. And
good. Okay, so as long as it doesn't affect you guys.
No. When does what's your ETA for getting that fixed? You told me, and I just don't remember.
It's not getting its fixed. It's when they install the fiber in our development. We don't know when that is.
Wow.
Oh wow, you're still.
Well, they put the stuff. It's at our house. So the question now is, when are they going to actually? I guess the power company has to come and power it all up. I don't know, something like that. So believe me, we're anxiously waiting.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure it's got to be a real pain in the ass that every time you want to stream that you have to go to the studio because you just can't trust it otherwise.
Well, exactly. Yeah. That's exactly it. Exactly. So,
That's tough,
what are you gonna do?
especially now because at least you could, I don't know, hang out at a Starbucks in the good old days,
First world problems, I guess.
Yeah, first world problems. Thank goodness for first world problems.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So,
Well, I hope that gets taken care of soon enough.
yeah, we'll manage it. Until then, I'm able to at least use the internet for business purposes,
Sure.
and that's what's important. So we'll see. All right, guys. Well, thank you. We'll see everyone next Saturday.
All right. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Everyone,
Bye, everyone.
take care.